Thanks very much for the introduction. Thanks for welcoming me here. Congratulations on your being on the shortlist for these awards. And I want to talk this morning about PR. Does anyone know what PR is? Has anyone got a really clear, concise definition of what PR is? No. So PR is kind of what you make it, and that's one of the lessons I've learned in the last 5 years since I left journalism and crossed over the fence to the other side, what some people refer to as the dark side when you've been a journalist. Actually, it's the light side, really, because the darker realm is definitely journalism, because it's focused on things going wrong. Negative stories predominate. If it bleeds, it leads. And after 18 years covering a lot of negative stories, death, disaster, destructions, scandals, resignations, I wanted to do something that wasn't quite so emotionally draining and relentlessly negative. So I stepped across the fence into the world of public relations, communications. Initially, I was with a corporate and financial PR agency called Headland, where I worked for some very big clients, running campaigns, sorting out their communication strategy, doing media relations, working on their social media, working on their content, doing a whole bunch of stuff. But it was really tough for me, coming from the perspective of a journalist, particularly working for the BBC, where I never had to work for an audience. There were millions of people out there watching the programs that I used to work on. And suddenly, I had to work really, really hard to try and get, a few inches of coverage for a client in a newspaper, or get them onto a radio program. And the slots that, as a reporter, I never even wanted to do. Like when I was a correspondent and they called me up from the Today program and said, can you do a live at 6:10 on the Today program? As a correspondent, I was saying, oh God, do I have to? Because I knew I'd go into the office and then be on the news channel and be on maybe the 1 o'clock news if I was lucky, and a whole string of other programs. So it was almost a hassle, an imposition as a correspondent. I didn't realize how lucky I was to be able to reach those big audiences so easily, when some of these corporate clients that I started working with, they'd love to be on the Today program at 6:10. It would be the biggest moment of their entire year, the biggest moment of the whole campaign. So part of what I had to learn when I crossed over from journalism into communications was a shift of perception, that it's not about blanket coverage, it's not about reaching millions and millions of people every day. It's just about reaching an audience in a way that's appropriate for you and your business, in a way that enhances the success and profile of your business. So I suppose that was lesson number one for me, that it may be that you only need to reach 10 people. If those people go on to become great clients or users of your services, that's a tremendous PR result. The boundary is also getting very, very blurred between public relations and marketing and advertising. So in the old days, like 15, 20 years ago, you had a handful of newspapers, you had a small number of television channels, you knew the rules of the game. And if you were in business, or if you were in politics, or whoever you were trying to communicate with, you knew you had a few options. You had your local press, you had maybe your trade press, you had your national business press, and you had your TV channels. Of course, everything has changed now. And the way in which we reach audiences and the way in which we communicate changed beyond all recognition with digital, with social media, and with the ease of content creation. And everyone's got the ability to record, edit video in their pockets, make their podcasts, put their content out, design whatever they want to design very, very easily. So part of the challenge is now, what even is PR anymore? What does it actually mean? Is there any difference between PR and marketing? The old distinction was, marketing and advertising, you're paying. You're paying to reach customers, you're paying for eyeballs, and you're paying for customer acquisition. Whereas in PR, public relations, you're mainly concerned with the reputation. You're mainly concerned with people knowing about you and people thinking about you in a positive way. So old school PR was just about talking to journalists, getting your reputation out there, people knowing about you, people thinking well about you. You wouldn't actually have to worry about client acquisition or sales or any of that commercial stuff. But now, of course, partly driven by technology, the worlds of PR and advertising and marketing have come together. And they are now almost indistinguishable in the sense that, you know, a lot of what we have to do in communications is to, first of all, establish a relationship with our audience, generate content, help people to see us, hear us, understand us, and all of that sort of traditional realm of PR. But that's, if you like, the top of the marketing funnel now. So it's leading people into something where they're going to actually ultimately want to buy from you, and you're going to make some kind of commercial sale. But the processes are linked. So it's still a big question, what even is PR? And so what I tried to do then was take a step back and think, okay, this is a very, very big and very complicated world. People are doing it in lots of different ways. Content creation, brand creation, engagement strategy, public affairs, strategic reputation consultants, the list goes on and on. And so I thought, well, I've never known an industry, the PR industry, in such denial, really, about what its core purpose is. And it's got to the point where most PR agencies, they don't even put PR in the name, on the name of the website. It's been expunged. You know, PR has a PR problem. And that's one interesting sort of thought and observation about the industry. So what I did was I took this step back and thought, well, what can I usefully do in this realm? What can I usefully do in this world? And how can I use my 18 years of experience as a journalist, where I went to those war zones, I covered those elections, saw those natural disasters, interviewed presidents, prime ministers, CEOs. How can I use that experience to in some way pass some insights on to my clients? And I didn't know the answer. And the only way I got to the answer was just to start writing and testing the ideas. And the result is the book. And the book comes from a huge amount of frustration, sitting through meetings with clients, you know, people overcomplicating problems, making things into very, very intricate kind of models and engagement grids and you know, stakeholder relations maps and all this kind of stuff. And I just said at one point, can't we just do PR for humans? Can't we just do something that works for people, that people are going to want to listen to and they're going to want to connect with? And so then the two big principles that I have tried to develop in this book and in my work is that the best stories are human stories. They're about people. And that storytelling itself is the most powerful and effective way of communicating. Always has been throughout the whole sweep of human history. Those with the ability to assemble powerful stories, both fact and fiction, have changed the fate of companies and of nations. They've hacked the path of history. So storytelling is incredibly powerful. And human storytelling, of course, is the only form of storytelling that ultimately works. That you've got to make something, and you'll be very familiar with this in the world of design, you've got to make something that works for humans, for people. Right? And if it doesn't, it ain't gonna work for you or your business. And the same is true, I think, in communications. The more we can see things with the human lens, the better. So I'm just going to run through a few principles for you of how I've tried to turn this book, which is about my experiences as a storyteller, as a journalist, how I apply those principles in the work that I do, which is quite a lot of communication strategy. So I'll do PR strategy for a firm, and I'll talk to you about that in a second and what I think it means, because again, lots of people will have different interpretations. And then some thoughts about applying that strategy in those situations that people find themselves in, whether that's needing to create content for websites, whether it's needing to do media relations, engage with journalists, whether it's needing to stand up at events and conferences and deliver speeches, and what the important points are about some of those things. So all of those things together, seen the principles that I outline in the book, is what I call PR for humans. And these are just my thoughts, and I haven't figured it all out yet, but I've spent the last 5 years trying to get a handle on how I can use my own experiences to help others and help clients. So the big point is that, and my philosophy about public relations and all forms of communication is we've got to see things through the human lens. So if we take a step back and look at a company, one of the questions that I'm asking myself in the audience is, does this company look and sound human? Can you identify characters within the company? Does what they're saying work for an audience of human beings, ordinary people, real people? Or does it look and sound corporate? People don't really want to connect with stories of corporations, legal constructs, those kinds of entities. They want to find out who are the people. Does the leader of the business have a heartbeat? Do they care about something? Do they have some values that they're able to communicate to their audiences? All those sorts of things are important, and to see the world through that human lens. Then I run clients through a sort of 3-circle model of storytelling, where I think the magic happens in the middle, where you've got a story of a business that's relevant for the audience you want to reach, that is told through a character. Now that character could be the CEO, could be the leader, could be an employee, could be an investor. It could be someone who doesn't even work for the business but is connected with the business. But the key to good storytelling, and it's definitely something that I learned in my years at the BBC, is that you've got to find the human interest angle into a big story. If something is complicated or difficult to understand, who is the character that we're going to connect with? And then the magic happens when you find that bit in the middle, where the story of the individual and the story of the business and the story that the audience want to hear are all intersecting in a nice place. And PR goes wrong a lot of the time when there's just the focus on the business. What do we want to say as a business? Nobody wants to hear what a business wants to say. They want to hear what is relevant for them, and they want to connect with a human story to do that. Now, this is what I call a story map, which looks complicated, and it's just my lens of looking at the world and trying to make sense of PR strategy in one slide, which I haven't actually seen anyone else out there attempt to do at all. So at least I've had a go. And what we're trying to do here is move an audience, right? So we've got an audience is starting in one position, and we want the audience to finish in another position. And that's all any act of communication is trying to do, whether it's a speech, whether it's a media interview, whether it's content, whatever. You're just trying to move an audience from one position to another. So audience may not be aware of you, and you want them to be aware of you and loving you and be in your fan club. Audience may have a certain perception of you which is negative. You want to change that perception. How do you do that? Well, I think there are a few different steps. There are not many steps, 4 or 5 steps that we need to go through. Thinking about the audience, who are they? And this is absolutely principle number 1 of PR and communications. Same with marketing, same with advertising. Who on earth do you want to reach and why? And that's often, there's not much work done on that point. People don't think enough about audiences, generally. So we'll talk about that more in a second. The CEO's office, what is the personal story that you want the audience to connect with and why? How does that story fit together with the company story? So how does the individual story fit together with the company story? How do we turn that into useful content that's actually going to work for our audience? What is the process of producing content ideas and themes that are going to be relevant? And then we've got the tactics. So we might do media interviews with local or trade media. We might do events. We might do, have a social media campaign. We might have content that's easily accessible on our own website. There's lots of different tactical ways that we can think about getting stories out and propagating stories. And I think the problem often comes with PR when people just focus on the tactics without thinking about the audience or who they are and how that's going to create content themes. They just think, oh, wouldn't it be nice to do some media relations? Let's find a bunch of journalists, build some relationships with them. Wouldn't it be nice to run an Instagram account? Wouldn't it be nice to create some video? Wouldn't it be nice to have events? And all those things can work on a tactical level and work surprisingly well, actually. But the real power of PR, I think, is when you get this strategy all right. So you actually really know where you want the audience to go to. You've really thought about who you are, and you've really thought about how human storytelling is going to be built into this to get to the people you want to reach, to make them into your fans. And at this point, by the way, and this is where the game has changed, you might need to pay. However good your stories are, however effective your content is, the world we live in, it's very, very hard to get traction without paying to promote your stuff, particularly on Facebook, but also LinkedIn and other channels. So that's the overall plan. We start with the wisdom of the crowd, how we approach audiences. And I think there's three things that we're trying to do with audiences: boost their awareness, change their attitude, and get them to do something, to take action. So one question I start with when I'm working strategy, PR strategy with clients, is what do we want the audience to do? What do we want them to do? Are we trying to change their opinion of us? Are we trying to just increase their awareness of us? Do we want them to have a certain position towards us? Do we want them to take action? So all those things are important. And again, we're leaking already potentially into the world of marketing here. This is not just about public relations and reputation and profile. It's about what do we actually want them to do. And thinking about audiences, and this is something that the PR world I think has learned from the world of advertising, we need to connect with them on an emotional level. And storytelling doesn't work if the emotion isn't there. Emotion is vital for storytelling. So to reach audiences on an emotional level, we need to try and get to understand them. Now we can get them in rooms and do focus groups, we can do big opinion polls, we can do surveys, but budgets almost never allow for that kind of activity. So we need to think really, really hard about what we know about our audiences. Who are the potential buyers of our product? What do they think? What do we want them to feel? What do we want them to do? But also some of these things like failures, what are their biggest frustrations that we can help them with? Is it that they really struggle to bring design thinking into the way their businesses work? Is it that they've tried lots of things in the past and they've wasted a lot of money? What are the failures that we can tap into on an emotional level? What feelings do we want them to have in connection to us? Do we want them to feel like we are problem solvers? We are there to inspire them. We are there to give them the motivation they need. What are the feelings that we want them to think? What's the fulfillment ultimately? And I think it's great being brilliant at things, but it doesn't get you very far in business, is my experience. What gets you places in business is solving problems for people. Identifying problem and being the solution to that problem. And that's one thing I've definitely tried to learn in the last 5 years. So what fulfillment? What do we actually want the audience to do? What do they want to be fulfilled about? And then fantasies, that's the bigger dream, the inspirational bit. So going through that and profiling your audience in that way. Into the CEO's office. Now, storytelling is about ideally an individual character. Could be a collection of characters, but the character can't always have an easy journey. And think of any movie, think of any novel, think of any work of fiction, there is a story arc. There are certain things that kind of need to happen for storytelling to work. And I've put it into this story summit model where stories are based on characters. The characters have to face some kind of challenge or tension. It can't all be easy or obvious for the character what to do. There's often a conflict. There's either a villain or there's something stopping the character getting to where they want to go. It's never an easy or straightforward path, and sometimes there's something stopping them. And again, that gives a story tension. There's a crisis moment. And in novels and in movies, this is the all-time low, where it looks like it's all over. It looks like it's desperate for the character, and they're not going to make it. And then something happens, a catalyst, that gets them to where they want to go, to the conquest. So when I'm looking at CEO storytelling or individual storytelling, I'm using this personal story summit model to give the story a little bit of tension. What I don't think you can do in communication and public relations is just make your videos, stand up on stage and say it was all easy, it was all obvious, we did this brilliantly, we did that brilliantly, it was all wonderful, life's a dream. It doesn't work like that. It's not realistic, and audiences are switched off by it. So we try to think about some of these areas in which we can just show the character journey in terms of challenges, struggles, and conflicts. Think of any movie. The Lion King is the perfect example of storytelling in action. You know, where you have a character, Simba. What is the challenge? He wants to be king. What is the conflict? There's an enemy that wants to stop him. There's a crisis, the all-time low in the desert. Then we get, you know, Hakuna Matata, and we get Rafiki knocking you on the head. And then Simba arrives, the circle of life continues, and the complete story arc is resolved. Resolution. Stories have to resolve in some way. So when we're thinking about our stories and our storytelling, we need to sort of think about some of these elements that bring tension into stories, that make stories real and relevant for audiences. So apply that into your own business. If you're telling your own story as a leader of a business or as someone working within a business, you know, what was your challenge? What's been the biggest conflict in your life? Where have the setbacks come from? What have been the moments of breakthrough? What's the kind of catalyst to get to where you are today? And all of those things, we recognize all of those characteristics as human audiences really, really easily and powerfully. And then when we take the story of the company, we need to think not just about the traditional narrative, which is what a lot of PR agencies will deliver. They'll say, oh, you know, here's the company, it does this, you know, here's where the company wants to go. I think audiences now also need to understand a bit more about the kind of why of the company, what it's rooted in, what the values of the business are, and for that to be very, very visible, whether you're a one man or one woman band or whether you're a huge multinational business. I think these principles apply. So I talk of the story tree, and when I'm taking my clients through this process, I'm asking them first of all, what are the values that they're rooting the business in? You know, what do they really care about? What are their defining values? What are their guiding principles? And this stuff is really, really important, I think, for growing businesses, attracting the right talent to you, and also sending the world a signal that you care about something. It's not just about making money. It's not just about commercial success. There's something deeper. So if my values are storytelling, my values are human communication. And then the why of company, and you might be familiar with Simon Sinek, or a lot of the emphasis that is put these days on the why of a business, which is really, really important in communication. And when I'm doing media training with senior executives, they'll often spend a lot of time telling me what they do and not so much why they do it. And if you say, well, why are you a consultant looking at advanced analytics? Oh, okay, well, I just think that I can change the nature of an industry by using data. Okay, now we're getting to why. We're getting to what really motivates you. And that's much more powerful when you're trying to translate that into blogs, interviews, videos, whatever, just to focus on those why questions as well as the values. And then you can get to the actually what you do and how you do it, your methodology, your principle, the way in which you apply those principles into your business life. So the story tree is the way I look at that. Just sort of finally, in terms of story creation, a checklist for content. Is it compelling? I mean, it's quite a sort of obvious word, but does the content that you produce in any way surprise an audience? Could you read that blog or watch that video or look at that, listen to that podcast and think, oh, actually, there were some things in there that were sort of quite surprising. Could you listen to that speech and think, actually, that was quite compelling because of the way it was put together? So compelling, original, new, these are good qualities that as a journalist we're always looking for. News is new stuff. What can I say today that I couldn't say last month, last year, or 5 years ago? What's the value in the current thing, the thing today that is most exciting or most interesting? And what does that look like going into the future? Is it timely? I mean, you could issue the same press release today as you issued last month, and the press release you issued today would get massive coverage, and last month it wouldn't get any at all. What's the difference? Timing. Timing's everything in news and PR. And some of that's about the news cycle, about whether a topic is current in your industry, whether other people are talking about it, whether there's a wave of interest in certain things. Part of it is just whether the journalists are going through a quiet patch and something lands on their desk at that moment where they've got nothing else to fill their programs, nothing else to put into their papers, nothing else to write articles about. So timing is everything. Emotional content is so important, and I think, particularly video, podcasts, audio, but also written word, if we can detect the emotion behind it, not just the analysis or the points or the great arguments, that's always going to be far more interesting to journalists and to other audiences than standard kind of, here's a list of things that we need to think about. Yeah, get the emotion in there. Why does it matter to you? Nourishing, useful to them, and true. And this may seem strange coming from a PR advisor, but the truth is a very, very important concept for me. And you can't lie in public relations. You can't spin much. You can spin a little bit for a short period of time, but ultimately the truth catches up with you. And what I'm really trying to do with my clients is get the best version of the truth. Right? So if life was a court case, reputation would be decided on the facts and the facts alone. Life's not a court case. We make our judgments quickly in audiences and with limited amounts of information. And that's why stories are so important when we want to reach audiences in the right way and carry our messages. Storytellers Paradox. This is something I learnt when I was working with a client, and I was preparing a speech for him. And he went through his life story, and he said, he had an amazing life story. He'd done ultra marathons, he'd done billion-dollar business deals, he'd worked in 20 different countries, amazing stories. And I thought, wow, as a storyteller, I'm away here. I wrote all this stuff down. I thought, great, at last I've got someone interesting to work with. But then I gave the story back to him, and it was just a list of his greatest hits. And he sounded like the most self-centered jerk you could imagine. So I always put this kind of humility check in there, which I call the Storytellers Paradox. Good stories and good public relations has got to be about you, but it can't be all about you. And you've got to be careful, and I've fallen into this trap a few times myself, where you stand up and you say this, brilliant, but the audience is switched off by that because there's no humility and there's no kind of sense of learning, growth. And that's why all the kind of whole leadership, coaching area is dominated by this idea of, you've got to fail, you've got to make all these mistakes, you've got to learn. And it's true because we don't like to hear from someone who sounds like they know it all, have done it all, have had an easy path. Again, it's back to the idea of challenge and conflict being really important. So remember the humility check. And I try and do this myself every day. I think, am I sounding too arrogant here? Am I sounding like I've figured it all out? And of course the answer is no. I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to understand more, and I'm trying to grow and develop as best I can. Medias, when we do media interviews, again, this is a sort of 5-point reminder that I do with my media training. And as I go off today to work with some corporate clients down the road at 10:30, this is where I'll start with them. And I will tell them that if you want to do media interviews, if you want to talk to journalists, you need a message. You need something that you want to say. You need something that the journalist is going to want to hear. Back to those circles. Am I in the circle that's going to reach my audience? Some emotion. Like, why do you care about it? Back to the why question. Why does it matter to you? Danger. Now, this is more of a one for some of the bigger corporates that I work with who have bigger issues, frankly, than smaller businesses. But be aware, what are the potential dangers when I'm talking to journalists? What are the things that I maybe don't want to talk about? What are the things that might get me into trouble if I do mention? So a checklist on danger. And some information. You don't want too much information when you're talking to journalists or talking to any audiences, but what are the key pieces of information that are relevant for that audiences? What kind of a media moment is it? What kind of an event is it? Is it an event where I'm trying to transmit information, or is it an event where I'm just trying to inspire people and give them a brief overview? And the anecdotes, the stories that tell that audience who you are and why you got to where you are today. Personalizing it. The best speeches, the best media interviews are to some degree personal. We want to hear from the person, the human being, back to the human lens. we look at our website, we want to see, in big companies and small companies, I think we want to see people as well as the stuff that you do. And this doesn't, this applies to greater or lesser degrees depending on the business. I mean, obviously in the area of design, you're probably going to have quite a few visuals that you really want to share. You're probably going to have quite a few ideas that actually look quite nice on the website. All that sort of stuff's great. But just don't forget the human bit, particularly if you want to interact with journalists and other audiences. What are the human stories as well as the design stories that you want to tell? Think of a human newsroom. And then finally, the best PR, and I'll open this up to questions in a second if this has triggered any thoughts, but the best PR comes not from you but from the movement you lead. And that's a sort of big ambition. Everyone's got to lead a movement, and it sounds quite grand, but it's something that I've certainly realized writing this book and trying to set up my stall a bit more, that once you identify your theme, and my theme is PR for humans, then I'm planting my flag somewhere, and I'm hoping that some people will come to me because I represent something. I'm seen as an expert on PR for humans, whatever that means, however I choose to define it. And that means, clients know who I am. They come to me and they help to sometimes promote my stuff. People want to work with me if they share my ideas. Some people may not. They may say that's absolute rubbish and definitely don't want to be part of that, and that's fine. But again, it's back to that point of tension. And if you've planted your flag somewhere, you said, this is what I stand for, this is what I believe in, this is what I think is important, then that helps to galvanize some kind of audience following. And it's the followers themselves who can provide some of the best PR for you, because it's really, really hard if you're on your own just shouting about yourself all the time. I did this, I did that, blah, blah, blah. And people get very, very tired of that very quickly. But if you can have allies, influencers, people who for whatever reason are kind of in your circle, sphere of influence, that's incredibly powerful. And much, much more powerful for you to write a guest blog, for instance, on somebody else's site than to put your own blog on your own site. Why? Because it's kind of validation from someone that you're interesting from an outside perspective. You don't just find yourself interesting. Similar with media relations. Why is it still important in a world where anyone can produce their own content, anyone can produce their own podcasts, anyone can write their own articles? Why is it still important ever to get an article in a publication? Because it's a stamp of editorial approval. And by doing that, you're saying, actually, I'm a person that other people find interesting. And all this stuff may sound too difficult, may sound like this is a lot of big, big things that I need to think about. I think this is a concluding thought. It's simpler than it seems if we just apply that human lens. And if we just say, okay, this is what I've taken you through here is my version of PR strategy, which I can apply to corporates anywhere in the world, big companies, small companies. But why don't we start with us and looking inside ourselves and thinking, who am I? What's the story I want to tell the world? And what I've found is if you're able to open up a little bit about your own story, then and show that sometimes vulnerability, sometimes growth, sometimes confidence, sometimes great moments, sometimes difficult moments, then people are drawn into you. And that's a powerful element of PR, when because you're honest about your story, you're able to bring other people into your story and find that those other people start to follow you. Okay, happy to take questions, but thank you very much for listening to that so far. Any thoughts from the audience about PR, communications, media relations, content, how to do it, how not to do it?
I'll just jump in
Yeah.
as an example for people. Deborah told me a story, I think it was the Pick and Luck guys mortgaged their house or something to redesign their business. something along those lines. So I thought that was quite a good example of what you're talking about, which is the human story, which is it's not about the product, it's not about the design of the product, it's not about the sales of the product. The thing that caught my attention was the fact that these people had risked their home to fund their dream. So that's the sort of thing you mean, isn't it, when people in this room are perhaps thinking, how am I going to sell my story?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's lots of different ways to do that. Stories don't have to be, tragic or incredibly dramatic or incredibly life-changing. They can be, and some of the best stories are. We love those entrepreneur stories, those startup stories where, everything was on the line, it looked like complete disaster, and then we found this idea, light bulb moment, on the path to success. We love those stories. But stories can be a lot more everyday than that. Stories can just be simple anecdotes about things that happen in your life. I was doing a speech the other day where it was the whole theme of the conference was how big companies support little companies. And the guy I'd been working with on the speech, he stood up and we just did this very simple anecdote where he's got two kids and there's a big kid and a little kid, and the big kid helps the little kid out with the breakfast cereal in the morning. It was quite a sweet little anecdote that just humanized that character, made him seem less corporate, remote, weird, and the audience connected with him. And then you could get into some of the more difficult and complex themes. So yeah, there can be like, here's this incredible risk that I took, here's how we threw everything as a family at this project, which is interesting because it's got family, it's got emotion, it's got conflict, it's got many of those themes that I was talking about. But stories don't have to be epic. So just remember that and think, in typical day, if you want to improve your storytelling, it's just about having your antennae up and noticing things that happen in the world and noticing the way in which characters and people behave. Like if you're trying to tell the story of design, what are the anecdotes that have given you insights about what works and what doesn't work in design? Are there sort of specific examples in your own life of fantastic design or terrible design? Can you apply that to your family, to children, to other people you know? So all those sorts of real experiences and real stories can be a useful and powerful way of just unlocking some bigger, wider themes, like why design might be relevant in business. And by the way, I'm using some of these, I've done some work with a very, very big consultancy that's doing a lot of work in design, high-end design for corporates. And it's exactly the same principles and ideas that they're talking about. So it's whatever level of business you're at, whether you're a small agency or huge global consultancy, and this is your theme, to connect it in such a way that people understand. Okay. Any other questions? Thoughts? Yes?
What do you think is the most powerful story you've ever told?
Well, there's a couple, and they're different. And so I went to Iraq a lot, to Baghdad during the peak of the violence, and this was 10 years ago, so 2007, 2008, 2009 time. And at that point, Baghdad was a pretty scary place, and a couple of thousand people were getting killed every month. The insurgency was near its peak, and it was dangerous, particularly for someone looking like me. We couldn't walk the streets. We had to just live in the BBC compound for 3.5 weeks at a time, go out very quickly, do little bits of filming around the city, and then straight back in to the safety of the protection that we had. And there's one story that I did in Iraq, and most of the stories I did were quickly forgotten, and nobody commented on. But there was one story I did, which was about the mental health consequences of the war and the time bomb, really, that the country was facing because so many young people had been scarred and affected by serious violence. And I did a piece with two boys. They'd both been orphaned by suicide bombings. Both lost both of their parents. And I was trying to talk to them about their experiences of all of this. And we sat down in in a park in Baghdad under the desert sun, and some quite nice grass. It would have been a nice park once, with slides and climbing frames and so on, but now it's just twisted lumps of metal. And we sat down with these two boys, and the older boy was talking quite openly about his hopes for the future, about what he wanted to achieve for himself and for the country. The younger boy couldn't speak at all. And I really agonized about whether to include him in the report because he didn't say anything. But I noticed that Steve, the cameraman, had got some very haunting close-up shots of his eyes, and that also this boy's hand was just shaking by his side like that. And I thought, God, I can't include that. Can I include it? Can't I include it? And in the end, I put him in. I said, the younger boy doesn't speak at all, but his shaking hands tell their own story. His shaking hands tell their own story. And then I sent the piece across to London, expecting it to play once on the BBC News channel, maybe be dropped. But it played very prominently on the 6 o'clock news, even more prominently on the 10 o'clock news. BBC World TV went around the world. Millions and millions of people saw that report. Messages of congratulation were flooding into me. And I felt two things. First of all, kind of elated. Wow, I've got this amazing story that's reaching people really powerfully. But on the other hand, troubled, because I'm not sure I should have included the boy. I didn't use his real name. I've now forgotten his name, shamefully. But that boy stays with me, and I think when I was putting that report together also, I was thinking as a father. I was thinking, what's my duty to protect this kid, to look after him. But it was a powerful lesson in storytelling that people couldn't connect with the big story of Iraq. They couldn't connect with the Sunni-Shiite divide. They couldn't connect with the political stuff. They couldn't connect with all sorts of things that were going on. But they could connect with a boy. And the boy with the shaking hands it was a very powerful human type focus story. So I think that, in terms of human storytelling, was a very, very powerful one. I also, there was 10 years before that, there was another encounter where, slightly, very, very different, but this person also has affected many, many lives. I was the first and last e-commerce correspondent at Sky News. So we followed the dot-com boom, and then we had the dot-com bust, and we were all sacked, and then I joined the BBC. But in that job, I went to a technology conference in London once, and there Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO of Microsoft at the time, was the keynote speaker, and I really wanted an interview with Steve Ballmer. And I did everything I could to get this interview, and I didn't manage to get it, and he went off, and I sent my report across to Sky Business Report, and that was kind of, I thought, the end of that. And this PR person rushed up to me and said, Mike, what about the other interview that you wanted to do? What other? I can't remember even setting up another interview. Yeah, with Jeff Bezos, you remember? And I said, yeah, okay, Jeff Bezos, whatever, because this is 2000. Amazon had only just launched a couple of years ago in the UK. I'd never used it. I was sort of aware it was a kind of online bookseller. And so I said, okay, we'll do the interview with Bezos. And then, Bezos came into the room. We only had one camera. I kept him waiting for about 10 minutes while I took the camera around and filmed my questions from the other side. And he was a very odd guy. I'm certainly not holding Jeff Bezos up as a good example of humanity, but he did some things very well in that interview. He had a real clear sense of the future, where it was going, how the internet was changing everything. He knew who he was and how he was there to change an industry. He had a backstory. He had a story of what he was doing at this moment in time. There was humility. He said, I'm very lucky. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't had the loan from my parents to set up the company. So there's all these principles I was talking about, and the principles in the book. I look back at that interview with Jeff Bezos and think, actually, he was doing a lot of that stuff back then. And so that's maybe another quite powerful lesson for me in terms of the stories that I covered, that those top business people just seem to have that sense of where they're going and why. So that's another story that stays with. Sorry, very long answer to your question. Anything other points?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
A lot of the people here obviously have won a design effectiveness award. I'm just thinking about the point Jess was making about, so we all want to tell the design story because it's the bit we're proud of as designers.
In terms of targeting a business audience who might at a later date hire us, how would you use the story of another business to try and attract other businesses to you? Does that make sense? So it's the success that we've had with one company.
Yeah.
So it's really B2B. You're using business case studies to attract other businesses into you. How do you do that? How do you start with that?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important, and something that small businesses have to do. I'd love to do it more, but I've made a client confidentiality a really important principle, so I'm not showcasing anything on my own clients. But I think for agencies and small businesses to actually see that validation of what you do through the stories of another business, then that is great, really important. And I think one way to do that is to focus on, you know, who you've done it for. Again, back to the human storytelling and the character. One client I'm working with at the moment, we are actually, in our PR strategy, we're moving her into the background a little bit, and we're moving some of the people that she's associated with to the front. So her website, the minute you go onto it, you're going to see 3 interviews with significant people that she has associations with. And so those interviews are where she is actually now going to play the role of the interviewer, which is something that we can think of when we're putting together our communications, that you don't have to be front and center of the story, but if you're involved in the story some way, it's good. So translate that into a video where the head of your business, you, whoever, is actually asking the questions, and you're on camera interviewing the person who you've helped. Is quite a good simple format, not too long. You know, good videos are 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, but just to capture some of the things that you've done with them. Then I think once you've got that content, you can then slice it and dice it in different ways. And so one question you should pose when you're thinking about setting up something like that, like a program of case studies. So identify your 3 case studies that you want to feature. Then think, okay, what do we need to capture in terms of the story from the individual, which is the person we've been working with. You could record that in some way, like a long video, of which you make a 2-minute video out of. You could turn the longer video into a podcast series, if you do a series of podcasts, put those together. And then, of course, the visual elements are really important, like what visuals do you want to attach to that? So I think those case studies by themselves won't generate you PR in terms of media coverage, but they might be a really useful add-on to support stories you want to tell. And when we were journalists in the newsroom, we'd always ask, yeah, what's the big story? But yeah, what's the case study, the human story that I'm going to illustrate that big story with? So if your big theme is, okay, here's my view about how design is changing business, and here's the case study of the company we did that illustrates that bigger theme, that's really powerful. But on the case study, I think, again, tight focus, character, human, what you did for them, how you helped them overcome a problem, how you helped them deal with a challenge, how you helped them through a crisis, how design was the solution to something would be a way of approaching that. But you don't have to do video, you don't have to do podcasts, you don't have to do blogs, you don't have to do any of it. And I think it's just finding what is comfortable for you and what medium you feel good in, or what social media channels you feel like work best for you. I think that is one piece of advice I'm trying to take more note of myself, is just bring focus to what you do. Don't try and be everything and be across every social media platform, spray stuff out right, left and center. Just do a few things really well. So rather than trying to do 10 great case studies, maybe just start with 1 and then do 3, and then think of how can we just slice that content into little packages that work for certain audiences in certain ways. Yes?
I found it really interesting what you were saying earlier about how journalists are really interested in the human element.
Yep.
If a journalist is visiting an agency website. So we're having a new website done at the moment, and it's something that there's kind of the range of people that I work with. Some of them all got different opinions of what the website should really hero and what should be on the website. I've just got a question around what advice would you give of how we can exhibit the people that work at the agency and what the agency is all about? How do we get that across?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm not a website designer, so I don't know in terms of look and design and feel how that would work best. But I think what I'd like to see if I was potentially going to work for someone, and I've been in a PR agency and I've dealt with the recruitment side, and I know that if you can show to the audience something that's most relevant for them. So it really depends, who you're trying to attract, what you want them to see. Do you want, is the priority to try to recruit like graduates who want to feel it's a fun and interesting and rewarding career and they can live their dreams? Or is it to reassure clients that you've got the most sort of expert senior people? I don't know. So it's partly about audience rather than, as the first step. And then again, I think a short video is always really powerful, but video can also be a trap. Video is very, very easy to get wrong if it just looks a bit scrappy. So one of the points I make in the book about video is it's great for capturing those little moments where everyone's got an iPhone, everyone can capture those little thoughts, little moments, little excitements. That's all easy to do. But if you're trying to profile someone, I think if you want a nice 2-minute video, that's a moment for a little bit of investment in some professional help. And I don't think you have to profile everyone in the business, but you might just have a couple of examples. Here's what it's like at this level working for this design business. This is a kind of the work they do. This is a day in the life, that sort of thing. So again, looking from the outside, you can immediately see, there's human beings doing interesting things, having fun. Caring about things. All those sorts of things are really, really, really good. But just a bit of care at that point about how much quality you can bring to video. And if you can't do the quality of the video, then just move back to good photography. And again, you'll know much more about the visual side of things than I do. But I think a lot of corporates go wrong with just the headshot type photography. That it's the easiest way of just sending an image to the world of we're bland and corporate. And in fact, I got to the point where I just didn't want to use photographers at all. So I just used a friend of mine who happens to be very good at photography to capture some moments, actually just of me speaking, of me interacting with clients, of me more in that kind of, in the moment type photography, which worked really, really well. So again, photography is a very, very underused aspect of PR. Very, very few PR firms will say, what you really need is great photography to capture these moments. But I think it's really important. So it's another way you could think of doing it.
I think obviously coming from a journalist point of view,
yeah.
What you were saying, that journalists want to know who works there as well. So I think really it was about from a media point of view, what does a media journalist need to get from the website?
Yeah.
So that's that point of kind of great quality photography, great content, seeing who the people that work there are, but also hearing the work simultaneously.
Yeah, and what journalists also need, perhaps more than anything else, is an opinion. So look at any newspaper and look at any TV program. Which are the bits that get quoted? Which are the bits that reporters use as sound bites? It's the opinion. And so, and I would think this as if I was putting together a package, say I was back at BBC Breakfast or back at the Business Today or whatever it's called these days, and I said, can you do a feature on how design is changing business? Quite an interesting subject. It's going to be quite visual. What would I be thinking of first and foremost in my mind? Who can I interview who's going to give me a good opinion about this? Like clear, concise, bold, and so I would want to showcase opinion. So when I talked about the human newsroom, what journalists want when they look at a company is can I just imagine that person in my piece? Are they going to give me a quote? Are they going to give me some colour when they talk? Are they going to talk in corporate jargon, or are they going to talk in human? Are they going to use memorable visual language? All those sorts of things. So what I'd like to see, and again, I don't know the best way of presenting this on a website, but what I'd like to see as a journalist is, there's interesting people in that company. They've got ideas, they've got energy, They've got clarity. They might be good people to have in my contacts book, good people to call the next time I'm doing that story. And then and the game again has changed, whereas in the past, there'd be the journalists would have their black book of contacts and PR agencies would constantly push stuff at the journalists. Now I think it's much more about, if you want PR, if you want journalists to know about you, you've got to have some way of engaging them with your content and drawing them to you, which is tricky, but journalists are just consumers of content like anybody else. So if what you're doing and saying on social media, if the content you're producing is interesting and compelling and is kind of in front of the right eyes of the right journalists who happen to be interested in what you're doing, then the next time they think, who am I going to call for that feature, or who am I going to get to comment on that piece? They're not going to go to their black book of contacts. They're going to just look at what's in front of them on their Instagram feed or on their Facebook. So it's another example of the way that the game has changed, I think, quite dramatically. Anyone else? Last thoughts, or should we wrap there? Given that we've done pretty much an hour, I think. So,
Mike, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.